Welcome everybody. Let's just give it a minute for participants to trickle in. In the meantime, my name is Simon Nicholson. I'm Director of the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy in the School of International Service at American University. Welcome to this webinar in our periodic series on carbon removal happenings. This particular webinar is looking at carbon removal in the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The occasion for the webinar, of course, is the release last week of the report from Working Group 3 from the IPCC. Working Group 3 focuses on what to do about climate change, the mitigation agenda. And we're joined by 4 speakers today to help us understand what is in the report and, as importantly, how to interpret and understand what's in the report. Our 4 speakers are first Dr. Greg Nemeth from University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's Professor of Public Affairs. He was a lead author on the 6th Assessment Report. Ben Rubin from Climate Nexus. Anu Khan, who's Deputy Director of Science and Innovation with Carbon 180. And Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, who's the Dean of the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University and Head of the Global Carbon Removal Partnership. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived and placed on our website along with a whole bunch of other resources at carbonremoval.info. So please check back there in a couple of days if you'd like to share the conversation from today. We have about 7 minutes from each of the speakers before we turn to questions from the audience and conversation. So please feel free to submit your questions as we go. Greg, we're going to turn to you first for an overview.
Great, thanks Simon for the introduction and to bringing us all together here. So yeah, and just to summarize, so the IPCC Working Group 3 have been working on this report for 3 years, and in the last 2 weeks of March, we engaged with governments on the summary for policymakers. And the reason I describe the process is just to make clear what a rigorous process of peer review and iteration and approval it was. And so the claims that come out of the report have been vetted in multiple times in many different ways with different perspectives. And I have to say, it was a pretty contentious review process, but I was really encouraged by what came out of the summary for policymakers. All of the main messages that we wanted to make came out in a lot of cases more clearly and often with more substantiation than were there going into the process. So I found it a really encouraging process, including the claims about carbon removal. So I'll get to those. But just to put carbon removal in context of the whole report, so the basic summary I'd say on the IPCC report is that the climate problem is getting worse, but the solutions are getting better. And carbon removal is potentially one of the solutions that is getting better. In terms of what makes the climate problem worse, Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 that talk about the science and the impacts make clear about the damages from climate change. So those are the clear motivation. But what we also documented in Working Group 3 is that emissions are still rising, and they've risen more slowly in the last 10 years than the 10 years before that, but they're still rising. And what the report makes really clear is that if we are to get to the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees climate stability, that we need to immediately start reducing emissions and get to net zero around mid-century. And that includes a role for carbon removal there. So that's the getting worse problem and the urgency. The getting better part, I think, is important to talk about too, like what's gotten better since the last assessment report that came out in 2014. 2 things that really come across. One is the cost reductions in low carbon clean energy technologies, especially solar, wind, batteries for electric vehicle, lighting with LEDs. That creates a lot of possibility. And 2, that we now, even though the globe overall is increasing emissions, that we have 18 countries that have reduced their emissions for a period of longer than 10 years. Absolutely. So this is not divided by GDP or any kind of intensity measure. This is reductions. The US is one of them. So we have policies now that have worked, and that's another contribution to the report as well. So I think that's the overall framing in which discussions of carbon dioxide removal also featured quite prominently in the report and in the summary for policymakers. And the basic takeaway there, and I'll just quote it to get it clearly, is in section C11 of the IPCC Summary for Policymakers. The deployment of CDR to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. And that's one of those claims that got a lot of attention in the approval process. But what came out is a very clear statement of unavoidable. It's not a conditional statement. It's we need carbon dioxide removal. And so I think that's something to be really clear about, is that these clean energy technologies have made so much progress that the IPCC is saying really need to scale up quickly. Don't compete with carbon dioxide removal. They're all just tools in the effort to get to net zero by mid-century. The other thing the report talks about is to think about the role that CDR plays in the near term, the midterm, and the long term. And the near term is kind of before 2050, the midterm is around mid-century, and long term is after that. So in the near term, there's potentially a role for CDR in lowering net emissions. It may not be a big role because we're still talking about scale up, but there's a role to play. In the midterm, which is where I think a lot of effort really is focused, that's probably the most important area, is that's where this counterbalance hard to abate sectors really matter. So if we do all we can to clean up the energy system, clean up the transportation system, clean up industry and agriculture, and we need to get to zero, and we still have some residual emissions because it's hard to do, that's where carbon dioxide removal plays a really crucial role. And then in the long term, after that, after we get to net zero, that carbon dioxide removal could play a role in becoming net negative. So we're actually reducing concentrations over the longer term. This is after mid-century. So I think it's interesting and helpful that the IPCC has kind of talked about the role that CDR can play, say, over the next century or so. In terms of how much CDR we should expect, that's where we get a lot of variation. And the range that, I mean, there's a few different ranges based on the conditions that you want to think about, but the range that I start with is a range of how much total removal in terms of gigatons will happen over the rest of the century. So that's over the next 78 years. And the range in the report is 20, so pretty minuscule amount, but not zero, to 660. And so if we use something in the middle of that range and divide it by 80 years and say that's maybe a mid-century estimate, we're talking about something like 5 gigatons a year in 2050, maybe 10. And to put that in perspective, so 5 gigatons, and we think of emissions of CO2 today, we're talking about 50. So if we're doing 5 gigatons a year by 2050, that's a huge scale up. That's a big role for CDR. It's still only 10% of the mitigation problem. So the idea that CDR takes away our need to reduce emissions directly, it just doesn't fit with that kind of math. There's no way that 10 or maybe even 20% of the problem makes us not have to worry about the rest of the 80 or 90% of the problem. So I think this moral hazard issue, maybe it's there rhetorically, but in terms of the math and the results in the IPCC, there's no way that CDR says we need to go slower, easier, or less aggressive on policy for emissions reductions. So I think but on the other hand, 5 gigatons is a tremendous amount. It means scaling up at something like 50% a year, every year for the next 28 years. If we're thinking about CDR that's at $100 a ton in 2050 and it's 5 gigatons, we're talking about a $500 billion a year industry. So the economic opportunities or the investment that's required is tremendous, even if we're only talking about 10 or 20% of the problem. And then just finally, maybe I'll just 2 last things I'd say. One thing that the report also talks about is to think about what are the considerations about the different types of CDR, things to think about with CDR. And one distinction that it makes is the type of removal process. So is it photosynthetic? Is it chemical? Is it geophysical? Time scale of the storage, how permanent is it? That's a crucial issue. Effects on arable land, that's another thing. And then also co-benefits. So because a lot of these other technologies that we think about and have started to get adopted are not just purely beneficial for the climate, they create other services. They make cities more livable, they make air pollution better. And so looking for opportunities for co-benefits in CDR, I think will be crucial for them to scale up at the rate they need to get to be gigaton scale by mid-century. And so the last two things I would say coming out of it, this is not in the report, but like my biggest concerns thinking about it is, can we actually scale it up to get big enough in the next 3 decades so that CDR plays the role that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says it needs to counterbalance, to give us a shot at 1.5 or 2 degrees. And then related to that, can it get affordable enough? Can it be widely available at less than $100 per ton? And those are two kind of open questions along with the co-benefits that I lay out there. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about what we found in the report on CDR.
That was admirably clear, Greg. I mean, it's a difficult report to try and synthesize in a short time, so thank you. So in addition to those scale up and cost questions, I also know that we want as a panel to be attentive to equity and justice considerations. And so Anu and Sanjeev, when they come to their remarks, I'll throw these questions that Greg just gave us to you. But first, Ben, can you give us a sense of how the press is responding to or seeing this IPCC report?
Yeah, happy to, Simon, and thanks for having me here today to speak about that. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar to hear more about IPCC and how it covered carbon removal. So I will speak to what Simon just talked about, how the report was covered. You'll hear that a lot of the coverage actually mirrors what Greg was laying out for us, which is a good thing that reporters were picking up on the same top lines in the report that Greg was echoing. But I think expanding on how the report was talked about in newspapers, on social media, the op-eds that were written about it, just gives us a fuller breadth about the perceptions of the report, how it was picked up and how it was covered. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. And by way of brief context going into this, to give an overview and talk about some of the coverage before diving into CDR specifically, historically, the release of IPCC reports have generated some of the most impactful climate change coverage that we've seen. If we look at a chart going back years in climate coverage and we see spikes of when climate change is covered, it's typically around the release of the IPCC reports. And I think that's generally because the reports are viewed as an authoritative global assessment on climate change. And just one other flag is context on the reports is typically a lot of the coverage is focused on what's contained within the summary for policymakers. The way that the IPCC approval process works, that's what registered reporters have access to when they get a final version in advance, and that's what they tend to report on. There can be more stories that come out following when the full report is released, but some of the coverages we talk about it today is what's contained in this shorter summary doc, recognizing that there's a lot of underlying chapters with even more info about CDR in particular. So just in terms of a couple of factors going into this, the reporters who cover IPCC, bless them, are working on incredibly tight deadlines to cover the report. Because there was some delay and last minute changes in the approval process, reporters had just about 4 hours with an advanced copy of the report before it was published, which added some unique challenges to this, to read through incredibly complex information, be it around CDR or any of the climate issues covered in the report. And then we know that the report was released during a crowded news landscape. It was coming during a week of Supreme Court nomination. It was coming during the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and that of course impacted some of the coverage. With that said, the Climate Nexus team has conducted some media analysis, and some of these numbers, are approximations. I don't want to present these as absolute, but just to give a sense of scale, we're estimating that coverage in print and news outlets in the US reached about 68 million people. And there was 36 front page stories in the US, and those included national outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post, as well as some local news outlets. There was coverage on broadcast that's estimated to have reached about 24 million people. And then on social media, conversations about the IPCC report had about 2 million potential views or impressions. And we were pleased to see in the report that it wasn't only covered in English-speaking news outlets in the US and broadcast. It was also covered in Spanish language outlets, including Telemundo and Univision. So it was great to see that increased accessibility in the report. And so, like I said, the report was released in a crowded news landscape. We had this big, I think, rollout of news that did reach tens of millions of people, but the report wasn't necessarily a multi-day story, although I think we'll continue to see since the report affirmed the need for carbon removal, I think we'll continue to see news in the weeks to come affirming this important need for carbon removal. The report overall, and I think Greg was also touching on this, had a theme of now or never, that this is really, there's an urgency and a need to move forward. And the report went further in calling out obstacles than we've seen in previous reports, and specifically talked about politics and financing as central problems. The report also helped elevate issues of equity and justice to expand on that related to climate change, and some nods to that in carbon removal as well. On carbon removal specifically, the report is one of the deepest dives that we've had yet on the necessity for CDR. And there were multiple stories that focused on carbon removal, just to give a sense of where CDR stacked up to some of the other coverage. Looking at coverage on April 4th, the day that the report was released, there was about 402 mentions of the word electrification in outlets, and carbon removal had about 60. So it shows that a lot of coverage was focused on mitigation and not only on CDR, but with that, there were several standalone stories on carbon removal. And the standalone stories, just to give a sense of the headlines, the Financial Times had a story come out that said carbon removal is unavoidable as climate change alarm bells ring. Climate Wire had a similar theme, carbon removal unavoidable as climate dangers grow, IPCC. And then MIT Technology Review, UN climate change report, carbon removal is now essential. And so reports that, and some of these words are in quotes like unavoidable and essential. And so some reporters in their coverage were picking up on exactly what Greg was saying, that the report affirmed the need for carbon removal in tandem with deep cuts to current greenhouse gas emissions. The themes in the story largely echo what Greg was highlighting the report contained, which is great. Reporters talked about the role that CDR has in decarbonizing hard to abate sectors of the economy, such as aviation. Coverage also talked about a wide portfolio of CDR solutions and the role for both nature and technological based solutions. Some of the coverage did talk about the moral hazard and quoted folks who have concerns about CDR. And then some of the coverage also, there's an ongoing challenge, as we see in some CDR coverage, where carbon removal can get conflated with carbon capture. The IPCC places CDR and carbon capture in two separate sections of the report and looks at them as different. And so that was picked up in some coverage, but not in all. And I think I would also add in just that CDR was also, I called out some standalone stories, but carbon removal was also picked up in some stories, just overall news coverage of the IPCC report when talking about the findings, looked at CDR specifically. It was included alongside other key findings of the IPCC report. And then typically after these major news moments, we see op-eds that can come out pegged to the report releases. There was about 10 op-eds that we've spotted relating to IPCC, and two that I want to call out just to highlight the range of opinions that exist around CDR. The New Republic has published two op-eds in the last few days. One was by Genevieve Gunther, pegged to the IPCC report with the headline, "Carbon removal isn't the solution to climate change." And then just yesterday, New Republic ran another one authored by 4 experts titled "Give Communities Control of Carbon Removal." And so I think it's interesting and worth calling out an outlet like New Republic really looking at and elevating the different perspectives that exist around CDR. And with that said, I think just in closing here, I would say that with IPCC affirming the need for carbon removal and that being so cemented and so much of the press coverage that came out, we should expect to see this invoked in future CDR news in the weeks to come. Today, there was obviously the major news of the Frontier Fund launching with $925 million raised. The Federal CDR Leadership Act, when that was introduced last week, invoked the IPCC report in that language. And just in terms of the IPCC news cycle, the Working Group 3 report is the last in the series. All of these 3 reports that have come out in the last few months will be synthesized in a synthesis report that will be released in the fall of 2022 ahead of COP27. And so another media moment when we might see some of these same themes about carbon removal and climate appear in the run up to COP27. And with that, I will stop and happy to expand more on some of the themes of the coverage during the Q&A.
Appreciate it, Ben. Thank you. We had a question come in about captioning. Forgive me, we don't have capacity for live captioning, but there will be a captioned video recorded version of this posted to our website in a couple of days. So for those of you looking for captions, we'll let you know when those are available. Anu, can I turn to you?
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you for inviting me to this interesting conversation. As Simon mentioned, I'm Deputy Director of Science and Innovation at Carbon 180. And Carbon 180, as I think many of you might know, is the first US federal policy NGO focused on carbon removal. Our goal is to champion equitable and science-based policies to catalyze the gigaton scale carbon removal sector. And so that's the lens through which I'll be talking about where CDR is today and where we need to be to meet the Paris targets as described in the IPCC report. But I'm also going to go a little bit beyond what is specifically in the report to talk about kind of the details of how we scale up this industry. So where is CDR today? There's a lot of activity and enthusiasm that I think we can all feel pretty optimistic about. On the supply side, we have investors like Breakthrough and Lower Carbon who are making big moves in this space, accelerators that are developing dedicated programs around CDR startups, and also startups that are launching across a range of pathways from enhanced carbonation and mineralization to innovations in biomass sequestration, electrochemical methods, ocean pathways, really a portfolio of solutions that are now in the innovation pipeline. That also comes alongside of activity from more established leaders in the carbon removal field. For example, Climeworks, I think last week, announced a $650 million equity raise. So there's a lot of room to scale there. And Occidental announced quite recently as well that they plan to build 71 megaton removal facilities by 2035. On the demand side, we're also seeing a lot of activity. I believe a couple of weeks ago, Airbus announced that they're purchasing 400,000 tons of removal over 4 years. So at that time, that was the largest single purchase to date. And as Ben mentioned in his remarks, last week, the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act was announced, and that's a first ambitious step towards government procurement of carbon removal in the US. And literally this morning, Stripe and their partners announced a $1 billion advanced market commitment over the next 9 years to purchase high quality removals. And in particular, I think it's great to be able to speak to government procurement and advanced market commitments together today, because the canonical example of a successful advanced market commitment was the pneumococcal vaccine. And that was a public-private partnership to align market-based financial incentives with the provision of public goods with a strong equity and justice component. So the goal of that AMC was literally to save the lives of people who otherwise would not have had access to these vaccines for years. So I think if you're in this space today because you believe carbon removal is necessary to prevent an enormous amount of harm and suffering to communities that contributed the least to this problem, we're in an optimistic and inspiring spot. That said, in terms of what needs to happen, there is an enormous amount of work to do. Just to reiterate a couple of points that Greg and Ben have mentioned from the IPCC report, our carbon budget up to about 2C is pretty much used up with existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure. We need removal at all timescales for hard to abate and residual emissions to reach net zero, and in the long run for net negative emissions to bring temperatures back down in a likely overshoot scenario. Existing land-based solutions have a role to play, particularly in the near term, but are not enough to meet our ambitious climate targets. And there are unknown feasibility and sustainability barriers that will depend on the speed and scale of implementation of these more nascent removal pathways. So there's a lot of work to do, and you can sort of sum this up by saying right now, sales hugely outpace our physical capacity to put carbon in the ground. I think we need to scale up our physical removals by about 6 orders of magnitude, which is a pretty massive interaction with our physical environment. And so to bring that back down to scale, what specifically needs to happen in order for us to do this? I'm going to speak to 4 big challenges between now and 2030. First, of course, is infrastructure. So these facilities, whatever solution you're implementing, you're going to need CO2 transport potentially, you're going to need geologic storage. All of this needs to be built out. Energy is also another really big one. I think we're all aware that taking carbon from this really diffuse form in the atmosphere and concentrating it, that just takes a lot of energy from like a baseline thermodynamic level. And so we're going to have to think a lot about the scaling up energy capacity. And then there's a lot of interesting questions around measurement, reporting, and verification of carbon removal solutions. This is going to look like specific tools for measurement. It's going to look like what happens with the data we collected from those tools. How can we make it transparent, open, available for modeling? And then, of course, around measurement, reporting, and verification, there's also questions of regulations and standards. And I think that challenge also flows into a challenge around risk and liability. So at scale, who is responsible for this stuff? There are some models from other markets that we can look to, like hazardous waste, maybe insurance markets, but I think there's this really big question where we're asking people to put carbon in the ground for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we believe policy is going to have a huge role to play in addressing all four of these challenges. And one particular policy lever that I want to talk about today in terms of something that we're going to need in the next few years is tech neutral innovation policy. So really thinking about instrument design for incentives, procurement, cost sharing that allows for a range of solutions to flourish in the next couple of years and keeps our options open. And you can see this kind of in our recommendations around 45Q, which is a tax incentive for geologic sequestration, around the Federal CDR Leadership Act, and also in our innovation and equity focused recommendations for the DOE Regional DAC Hubs program, which is a $3.5 billion program, probably the biggest government investment in CDR to date, and how we can do this in a way that really allows new companies to enter the field and scale, and so we can have a portfolio of solutions to work with. So to kind of summarize that point, I think, what does CDR need in the next few years to scale? One thing, among others, is tech neutral innovation policy that incorporates principles of equity and environmental justice in order to foster a portfolio of CDR solutions that can scale up both quickly, but also responsibly, taking communities' perspectives into the discussion.
Thank you. Sanjeev. And Sanjeev, you're muted. You need to unmute there, please.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Simon, and it was great to hear Greg and Ben and Anu, and thank you for hosting this very critical moment. Can you see my screen? I just want to just share it a little bit, and I'm going to hide this so that everybody can see it.
We can. Thank you.
You could. And then I'm going to go from current slide. So I guess I want to start with, I totally agree, obviously, with most, if not all, of the comments. I guess part of what I want to start off with, just partly because we should have a fun panel, even if the topic is dire, and one that gets us a little bit of creative tension. Greg, you started off by I would, as I interpreted, sort of glass half full in the IPCC report. I would, say, and most people know me as a possibilist, so I'm always pretty much believe that we can do anything as a humanity, that the glass is half empty, and particularly with respect to carbon removal. Carbon removal, and thanks to folks like Ben and others, and Carbon 180 is starting to get into the public visibility, but it's still far, far away from ordinary people's knowledge, and understanding of how critical it is as one of the three critical pillars for climate transformation. Over the last 2 years, basically 2.5 years since January of 2020, right before or right as the pandemic was emerging, we launched a task force on global carbon removal, a multi-stakeholder task force, starting with Davos at WEF. It involved companies, government, civil society, academic institutions. And the goal was really to do what Anu was saying, and Ben in some sense, how do we actually go from, really important, absolutely essential IPCC reports to actual action at the ground, on the ground, and to get to scale, whether it's 5 gigatons by mid-century, I believe we need to do a lot more than that personally, and I think that we can, in fact. So out of this came the Global Carbon Removal Partnership, which we launched in COP26. And if I could just take that moment in time, there was virtually nothing on carbon removal at COP26 outside, a little bit here and there. And so our goal, and maybe there's a big message for this, my portion, is that we want to get to Egypt at COP27 and the UAE at COP28 and make sure that carbon removal is seen as one of the 3 critical pillars of climate transformation. We all know we have to adapt, and certainly the governments and society, civil society, and companies we work primarily with in the global South, which is really a critical part of, we can talk about equity and social justice and environmental justice, but the key thing is how, in particular, our disadvantaged communities, and particularly the global South, involved and driving the agenda. And we know to date, and with respect to carbon removal, it has been relatively far and infrequent. And so what we focused on in building out the carbon removal partnership is to have real leadership from the global South. And I'm going to come back to this in a second. The point of this slide is we really have to scale, obviously, climate mitigation and decarbonization. IPCC is right. Greg, reported on it. We all agree. There's no question, and it's good to hear that 18 countries have absolutely, reduced their carbon emissions. At the same time, we're far, far away from where we need to be. We all agree that. For global South, and particularly, as we know, low island states and many others, climate adaptation, resilience remains the top priority. And when people talk about an African COP in Egypt, they're really talking about prioritizing adaptation. But we've been working with particularly governments like the government of Kenya, Colombia, increasingly Egypt, others around the world, companies, civil society organizations, to advance a truly kind of systemic approach to scaling up carbon removal efforts. And that's, heretofore, there's been 3 challenges, and they build on Anu's wonderful summary. Number 1 is, and if you go from right to left on your screen, is agenda setting. And not just agenda setting at the global and regional and national and local level, but making this a publicly understandable, effort, that is to say, carbon removal. And the way we think about it is it's planetary waste management. Just like garbage, unfortunately, that we put out into our streets and our, and our forests and our waters and so forth and so on, we have, we polluted the air. We can't see it, but we polluted it. So we need to remove it and recycle it, hopefully, in addition to reducing on the other hand. And so what we've tried to do is really focus on how can we increase the public awareness and the political prioritization of carbon removal. And we're working very hard to make sure that COP27 is truly a carbon removal COP. Not exclusively, because it has to be, again, these 3 pillars, working in tandem, simultaneously, scaling together, interacting, make sure we don't get into the hopefully false divisions of moral hazard and so forth and so on. We need both carbon removal and decarbonization, but we need to put this at the top of the global, national, local agendas, as well as make sure that the broader publics are out there, and particularly from the global South, not only understand this, but are driving it. The second is policy. We have advanced a set of high-level principles for carbon removal. I'll come back to that in a second. We're pushing a lot on how do we enable national and local regulations, as Anu was mentioning, and then really also trying to get key governments to start to identify what part of those indices are actually carbon removal relative to decarbonization, and then standards and certification. We've actually had now 5 consultations on trying to develop at least a more unified framework for carbon removal, standard certification, accounting. Finally, on the market side, carbon negative pledges, carbon removal, public-private partnerships, carbon removal financing. It should say also, just solutions more generally. And so this is kind of the overall approach of the multi-stakeholder carbon removal partnership. There is a UNGA resolution talking about making this really visible and getting it up on the political agenda, global political agenda, led by the government of Kenya at the UN. On terms of principles, we've been advancing a global consultation, and it very much confirms what our other panelists say, that we need to have more or less 5 key principles for any responsible carbon removal at scale. It has to be durable. We have to focus on performance, obviously social and environmental equity, transparency and accountability, and inclusivity. And that's where, again, this has to be multi-stakeholder, and the Global South in particular has to be at the front. We see many more carbon removal pledges out there, but we need to see much more, and those pledges need to be much more clear and effective, as well as implementable, and that's why the markets are so critical. Here we're talking, this is the process in terms of certification of carbon sequestration. So we really have to move forward in each of these areas, and that's what the Carbon Removal Partnership. The reason I'm going through this is the IPCC report, or the working group latest thing, and obviously 2018, all of this stuff is helpful, but it doesn't get us to the action. And that's what we're really focused on. It all is helpful to get the legitimacy, the credibility. We obviously believe in the science, we'll always be science driven. But right now, carbon removal still remains far from political policy circles and market circles. As Anu rightfully said, as Ben said, it's starting to get moving, but we really, have to go much faster and scale, in a much more aggressive way. And so what we've developed is a Global South, Global North partnership, co-headquartered in Nairobi and Los Angeles, led by, as I said, governments like Colombia, Kenya, Egypt, and others. And the focus very much is now to have, we're building out an advisory board, the task force, the membership of which, was fantastic and worked hard for 2 years, is very much engaged and supporting. And so this really, I'm going to end the show and just finish with my last comments, stop sharing, is really that we need to, dramatically move from the focus on carbon removal as an add-on to carbon removal as a central pillar of climate transformation. And it has to be more often than not led by the Global South to make it turn the political agenda. And we have to accelerate the policy and market work. And the stuff that Carbon 180 is doing, the incredible work that Ben and team are doing in terms of getting it out into the public and media. It's great to see increasing coverage, but I'm sure Ben would agree we need far more all around the world. We're really pushing on that. So, sort of the invitation now is based on the recent working group report and previous IPCC, but the broader sort of coming together of stakeholders. We really do need, and we believe the multi-stakeholder global partnership is one critical mechanism to, cohere a concentrated effort to scale carbon removal solutions. And the partnership of Carbon 180, the great center in American University, we see this starting to come together, but we have a big job to do between now and COP27 for it to be truly right there at the center alongside adaptation and mitigation, which again, adaptation and mitigation are very much, particularly adaptation, on the minds of our African government and civil society colleagues, corporate colleagues, particularly as they think about an African COP. Let me end with this final point. If you start from the main argument, we have to do planetary waste management, reduce, remove, recycle, very straightforward. We can share that with our kids. Carbon removal is central alongside adaptation and mitigation. Natural and technological solutions can come together. They have to be undergirded by a set of principles that we shared, and social and environmental justice and equity have to be at the core of that. And it requires a multi-stakeholder effort led by the Global South. That's what we're about, and that's what we believe is absolutely central as we go to COP27, COP28, and beyond. And we believe we have to be much more aggressive, going out to 2050 even, let alone 2100. Thanks so much, Simon.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And thank you, everybody. We've got a number of questions that have come in. Our practice is to collect questions and have them available to speakers after the webinars as well, so that written responses can then be attached to the recorded version of this webinar. So if we don't get to your question, never fear, we will seek some written responses. I encourage the speakers to dive through the question list. Let me know if there's something you'd like to respond to. But Greg, I'd like to turn the first question to you. We heard words like necessary in your presentation, and some of the questions that are popping up in the box here are saying, really? Is carbon removal necessary, and how can we have faith that carbon removal might actually emerge at the scales that you were talking about?
Yeah, so is it necessary? So there's a couple of ways of mitigating climate change where the claim is you wouldn't need carbon dioxide removal. And so there's, over the last 4 or 5 years, a cluster of scholars and analysts that have looked at reducing demand for energy. And there's a whole chapter now, chapter 5 in the IPCC report is about demand for energy services. And the claims there are that we could reduce emissions by 40 to 70% just by doing things like more efficient energy use, designing cities, lifestyle changes, plant-based diets, that type of thing. And if you take all of that potential and put it together, you can get to a 1.5 degree target with a fair amount of confidence and not need carbon dioxide removal. So there are pathways that exist. And in the comments, there's another even more aggressive pathway that said we get to zero emissions tomorrow. And then we also don't need CDR for 1.5, at least, with like 67% confidence. So yeah, there are pathways that exist, but it's a marginal community arguing that we can get to 1.5 degrees without CDR. And maybe over time that community makes a stronger case, and then we'll have to think about that. But right now, the case that everyone in the world is going to limit their footprint to 10 or 30 square meters of living space and switch to plant-based diets and do all the things they need to do to get to this low energy demand, high well-being lifestyle. It's possible, but it may be more of a stretch to do that than it is to scale up carbon removal to gigatons by 2050.
Okay, the other theme that I heard from a couple of the presentations today is we need to speed things up. The IPCC report is telling us, get moving, get as big as possible, as fast as possible. At the same time, we're hearing from voices say in environmental justice circles, no, now's the time to slow down because we need greater assessment of the options. We need more community input. Sanjeev, I wonder what you're hearing from voices in the Global South about the ability to engage in this conversation. How do we square that circle? The need to go fast and at the same time provide space for input.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, every time we talk to anyone, and I'm from the Global South, I was born in Uganda and Kenya, to folks in the Global South, and they start to capture what we're talking about and what it means, they're all in, Simon and everyone. They, so if you really talk to civil society and governments in the Global South, they see the absolute necessity of this, the mathematical necessity of it. Greg, fair enough. Like you said, there is this, very small percentage, like, a pathway where we don't need it. I think we're all realists in that sense, pragmatists. We're going to need carbon removal, and that the more we actually focus on it and actually do it, that's what they're ready to do. And so, particularly when we're talking about natural solutions, which have obviously the immediate and most, the most immediate opportunities, if we think about making sure that co-benefits, as we've talked about, all of us and believe in, are integral to these projects, like a reforestation project in Tanzania and Kenya, one in Colombia that we're advancing with private investors from the global north. How do the NDCs, the credits actually be, how are they counted in NDCs versus carbon markets and things like that? All of this plays an incredibly important role. But we just have to, people are not, as far as we can, in our conversations and engagements and actual practical work, and I'm sure Anu will agree with this, there's a hunger for advancing this. And I would say it's not just natural solutions. The government of Kenya is just setting up a center on global climate solutions and innovations. And they very much want to engage, for example, direct air capture. When will we actually have a direct air capture, in the Global South? The real inequity is that nothing like that is being planned right now. That's what they're saying. Why is that not that tech transfer not happening? That could enable the Global South to actually maybe get also some financial and economic benefit that they can make sure is distributed in terms of livelihoods, jobs, equity, and so forth. So I think that if we stick with the principles and we continue to make it clear that in all reasonable scenarios, carbon removal at scale is absolutely necessary, and probably much more necessary than even IPCC is is, intimating, frankly, then folks get on board and start to be creative. And I will go back to this. I believe that humans are ingenious and capable, and we can, if we have the right value set, make this happen. And the Global South, and it's hard to even say the Global South, folks across the Global South have been very engaged, are now taking leadership roles, Simon.
Thanks. Anu, did you have any response to that particular line of questioning, or are there other questions that are popping up there that you'd like to pick up on?
Around the equity and environmental justice piece?
Yeah, and just squaring this need, if we read the IPCC report through this necessary lens, this need to scale up quickly, versus also the need to provide space and time for consultation and input.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I want to say that I'm not our internal expert on these topics, and we have fantastic resources. So we'll share those after our We're Moving Forward report, for example. And if someone's really excited about this part of the work, would love to connect you with my colleagues who are very knowledgeable about the environmental justice work. That being said, when I think about speed and scale done responsibly, one of the things that we can do quickly is bring communities into the conversation, develop educational materials to make it easy to understand what the options are, why they're needed, and to develop tools and resources that answer the question, understand the questions that communities have, and develop tools and resources that respond to those questions. So that's one way that we can think about speed and scale. I would also say, as a scientist and someone who's optimistic about the role that science can play in this challenge, I'm excited to see a portfolio of solutions being developed, because it means we can deploy these solutions in different places. They have different constraints, they have different needs. Some are going to be land-based, some are potentially ocean or coastal. They have different energy and land use requirements. And by having a portfolio of solutions, we can engage with communities around options. And it's not just here's the thing, this is what it looks like, you can take it or leave it. You can have a more robust conversation. And I think one of the really big co-benefits that's going to come from scaling CDR is an economic co-benefit. At the scales that we're talking about in the IPCC report, this is $1 trillion industry. And I think it's really important to think about how will those economic co-benefits be shared equitably with communities. And so I think that's another lens through which we can think about this.
Could I just jump in one on the number there? Because I totally agree with Anu, and Greg mentioned half a trillion, you mentioned $1 trillion. Our assessment was that it's $1 to $3 trillion, and $1 to $3 trillion a year industry by 2050. And if you do economic valuation of it, it's actually $3 to $5 trillion in social benefit. So it has a huge upside potential in terms of supporting communities' livelihoods, justice.
Thank you both. Greg and Ben, there's some questions about agroforestry, other forms of biological lands-based carbon removal in the question and answer section here. Greg, can you give us a sense of how agroforestry, other forms of biological carbon removal were treated in the IPCC report, how we should understand potential and so forth there? And then Ben, anything you can tell us about how these categories are finding their way into the press, and how we should understand the public conversation about different forms of carbon removal.
Yeah, I mean, agricultural-based solutions, and I guess I would say agriculture and forest-based solutions, that's the part of CDR that the IPCC and IAM models has included for a couple of decades now. And then over time, that's evolved from forestry to bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. And it's only recently that we've started to see these models that inform the IPCC results explicitly include other technologies like direct air capture. So the default, and it has been kind of to think about land as a place to store or capture carbon. And the big impact that these very simplified models of the world, but very complicated models to run and maintain, their basic impact is that's tough on agricultural price, on food prices especially. And we know how sensitive societies are, states are to changes in food prices. We're seeing some of that right now for non-CDR related reasons. And so, I mean, that's the number one issue that comes up on anything that's, a land-based solution. And there's other issues as well that have to do with biodiversity and, industrialization of agriculture and things like that. But the just number one basic impact on food prices is something that if you do a lot of land-based CDR, you have to have some answer for, because that's the one that we know people are incredibly sensitive to for good reason.
Thanks. And yeah, I would echo and agree with Greg on his take and say that I think largely the lion's share of the coverage that I've read has mirrored that finding, because the IPCC Working Group 3 report does not make a clear recommendation on which approach for carbon removal is best. The coverage talked about the benefits of pursuing multiple approaches at once, or that there wasn't a one size fits all, or that it could vary in region to region. There's some coverage that might drill into one particular approach than another, or weigh the pros and cons of them, but just because there wasn't that clear finding that we should pursue one in the report, and that there's benefits to pursuing multiple forms of CDR in tandem, I think some of the accompanying media coverage of the report also carried that as a through line.
Thanks, Ben. In a very different vein, we have a couple of questions asking about what the Russian invasion of Ukraine means for our thinking about carbon removal, what it means in terms of the scrambling of energy markets, and also the potential for international cooperation. Any thoughts?
I just high level thought. So first of all, with IPCC, there was a lot of interest in that in the approval process, because governments, that's certainly a high priority, a higher one than climate change right now. Because of the way IPCC works, we couldn't incorporate new research after the October 11th, 2021 publication deadline. And so that was, we didn't have anything to go on with that. But, outside the IPCC, the potential here is that we have a focusing event that is as impactful for energy and environment as the oil crises in 1973 and 1979 were, that had very long-term effects that led to dramatic increases in fuel efficiency of houses, of cars, of switching, of the early innovations in renewable energy, and eventually batteries as well. And so on one hand, that's kind of probably the medium to long-term impact of this raising of energy security as such a high profile. And I think the solutions to it very much align with dealing with climate change, including carbon removal. In the near term, it's a crisis, and it's hard to make decisions that are good for the long term when you're in a crisis. I mean, there is this idea that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, but I think that's more of a medium to long-term impact. I think there's concerns in the near term that we have solutions to dealing with fossil fuel dependence that involve a lot of fossil fuels, and there's no way that carbon removal is a way that we get both of those. If we're gonna, that's one thing that the IPCC report was very also unequivocal about, that also led to a lot of questions from governments, is that we have to reduce our fossil fuels, and there's no sense in which we can kind of maintain or increase our dependence on fossil fuels and use carbon capture and sequestration or carbon dioxide removal as a way to have both of those. So yeah, the math just doesn't add up on that one.
Okay, and then there's another set of questions here about private sector engagement with carbon removal as a subject matter. Sanjeev, I see you responding to some of the questions in a written form. But we heard, Anu, about some of the recent corporate announcements. There's also some questions here about global corporations and their responsibilities through their supply chains to be thinking about carbon removal options. How is that figuring into thinking?
You want to go, Anu, or do you want me to jump in?
I'm happy to follow up.
Okay. Okay, so we know that it's a great question, and we're at the infancy of this absolutely essential part of it, which is through global supply chains. If you look at, for example, what Microsoft's been doing, it's been really very aggressive in trying to map out how through its global supply chain it could hit its net negative commitment. But as you saw probably in the Science article or everything that's been discussed and very openly by Microsoft, there's just not enough carbon capture projects out there, enough supply to get going, and the R&D and the capabilities on the supply chain side is still at its early part. There is another question, and I think I don't know who it was, is about, it's so aggressive to get to 5 to 10 gigatons by mid-century. I think there's sort of 3 points I want to make on this assignment. Number one is, we had 0 cars in 1900, 0. We know how many cars we have in the world. We can certainly scale technology and natural solutions when there is, as we put it, the political prioritization and public understanding, the policy frameworks, and the markets. And that's why we have to, focus on that. And number two is, back to the Russia point, it very much seems to me like Game of Thrones. Here we are, we're like worried about who's on the throne and winter is coming. And so, as that is the case, my own view, and this is where I believe the IPCC report is not sanguine enough about the absolute necessity to scale carbon removal, because it doesn't have a very good political economy analysis. One of the continuous failures of IPCC is its underestimation of political economy. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a perfect example of that. And there are many others, right? So let's be serious and understand that, all these efforts at decarbonization, which absolutely have to happen, I totally agree, I'm not suggesting otherwise, we have to recognize that carbon removal is going to be absolutely central, without question, and far more greater extent, and we have to get it done. It's really not a choice, in my view.
So we have just 2 or 3 minutes remaining, Anu, and another question which has popped up in a similar vein is about whether all of this is just a lifeline to the oil and gas industry. I know we don't have time to dig into the complexities of that, but it feels important to flag. And so with a couple of minutes remaining, I turn to you.
I'm happy to jump in here and say, I think that's something that we think about a lot and we want to take seriously. Another way to think about carbon removal is not just, everything that's going to happen down the road as described in the IPCC report, but from the lens of legacy emissions. There's already 2.4 trillion tons, I think was the number in the IPCC report, that humans have emitted since 1850, and that is causing harm today. And carbon removal is the only way to address that harm that's already happened from legacy emissions. So I think, yes, there's a conversation about what happens in the future and CCS and the intersection between CCS and CDR, but there's also a really clear case that the only way to address the harms from legacy emissions is really through removals.
Thank you. You were so brief. We have 2 minutes remaining. And so any final quick thoughts in response to any of the lines of questioning that we haven't covered yet, or anything else you'd like to give us by way of exit comments?
I just would say, there's a great question about Anne in Washington, D.C. that I responded to, but what she was saying is, aren't the carbon removal standards, the unifying framework that we're advancing through the partnership, basically duplicative of the DOE and US standards or others? And what we found was that there was dozens and dozens of partial standards, so forth and so on carbon capture, carbon removal. We need a unified framework. And most importantly, the underlying assumptions had to be made more transparent of various standards. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so there's going to be a white paper and a guidance that's going to come out of the series of global consultations that we've been doing with great partner organizations like Carbon 180, for example, and Conservation International and many others. So that's what we're trying to advance, is really a unified framework, not something that really connects the dots and coheres what we already have, which is pretty much a patchwork of governance arrangements.
Anybody else in the final 20 seconds? No. Hey, well, let me just say thank you to you all. There's a lot to cover. And again, Greg, that was an admirable introduction given the complexity of the reports. And thank you all for the contributions to a very rich conversation. Again, a recorded and captioned version of this webinar will be available in a couple of days on our website. The website address is carbonremoval.info. My name again is Simon Nicholson from the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy at American University. Thanks to Sanjeev, Anu, Greg, Ben. See you all again soon.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe and healthy.